Last week, I got some work done in the alleyway section and made some improvements that I've been meaning to for a while, and this week in Delfino Square is going to be pretty similar. I started things off by copying some more building faces from the white buildings to progress the alleyway section a bit further. Eventually, I had finally finished putting down the white building faces, and I figured I'd start doing the gray buildings next. It ended up being the roofs that were the most interesting here. There were quite a few times where there'd be two buildings next to one another that both needed roofs, and the easiest way to do so was to extrude the second roof out of the first one. In fact, when I was getting sick of setting these faces up, I decided to just start putting these red roofs on buildings, since it was a more enjoyable and kind of separate process to the rest of the building face. And that led me over to the buildings across the bridge. These ended up being collateral damage when I started updating the alleyway section originally, so I'm gonna get to fixing this. There was definitely some wacky UV stuff going on, but the main thing was actually the lack of roofs on these buildings. I was gonna have to make sure each building had some kind of roof overhang, and the way I did that for the larger sections of roof was inset a face on top of the building and bring the middle up a bit. Then I could scale the whole thing up after separating it and fill a face on the bottom. I cleaned up some of those awful UV maps and fixed a line in the seam of the dirt path texture. And I think this area is off to a decent start. Well, now that we've made some pretty good progress in this right half of the track, let's make some more miscellaneous improvements to other sections. The first thing I want to try is adding some color to the road. Something you guys have been suggesting for a while now. But this time, instead of haphazardly throwing yellow on the texture, I'm going to use the original road texture as an example. Now the change is subtle, but I think it adds a hint of variety that gives the road a much more interesting look when viewed closely and a wash of vibrancy when viewed at a distance, which is a pretentious way of saying it's got pretty colors now. The next thing I want to do is make the Pianta statue look a little bit better. The main issue here is the blue color not really working. I think a copper color would make a lot more sense. So of course I used a good old-fashioned color overlay. I tried mixing an unoxidized copper tone in there somehow, but I think that's something that would require a much more specific map to unwrap the statue onto. But either way, this definitely looks better. Well, now I can move on to something that's been an issue for many episodes now. The texture on the yellow buildings. Oh look, here's a good texture. Well, that was way too easy. Might as well go clean UV maps up or something. And during this process of messing with UV maps, I noticed that I didn't really like the darkening on the sides of the road texture. So I opened it in Photoshop and used the dodge tool to brighten it up a bit. It took some jumping back and forth and making minor adjustments, but in the end it looks a lot more consistent. I think updating the building texture, working on a few UV maps, and enhancing the road a bit has made a small but noticeable impact on this area. Now I want to do more here, but let's get something started real quick. For a while, I've alluded to the idea of a shortcut running through the park, and even have the beginning of an entrance, but I haven't really fleshed the idea out very well. So I spent a minute and modeled a road that could be the basis of the shortcut. Now I made sure it swings out a decent bit so as not to cut too much time off, and I think it could be a dirt path, so that it only makes sense depending on your vehicle and power-ups and whatnot. Plus I'd also like this to be a more dangerous path as well, maybe an enemy or two, or some patches of mud that would require a mushroom to boost through. This isn't a commitment to this design, just me putting forth the idea and seeing what you guys think of it or might change about it before moving on with actually making it. Well, that seems like a good enough idea to work with. The next thing I'd like to work on is actually over by the trees. Don't worry, I'm not changing them again. I kinda didn't really finish updating them before, actually, because while I did put down some leaf piles, I never updated the scattered leaf textures on the ground. So I got those textures open in Photoshop and started updating them. And once I got the scale right, this looks pretty nice. But they're kinda clipping through the ground pretty bad. Cause remember that cool thing I did where I gave the terrain some variation to make future details here more interesting? Well, I can't say I was wrong, this is pretty interesting. But to make it also make sense and not look super glitchy, I used a shrink wrap modifier on these leaf circles. I also made sure to inset some faces on the circles to give the shrink wrap modifier sufficient geometry to work with. And I had to set it to snap onto the outside of the surface, not on the surface. Well, now that that's sorted, I should also update the texture of leaves that runs along the roadside. Again, the tricky thing here was getting the scale of the leaves right. And actually, I had to completely change how the texture works by having it be a basic vertical tiling strip rather than whatever kind of crazy diagonal wizardry the old one was using. And you know, this is a good time to show you how I tiled this. To make sure the top meets the bottom and loops the texture as it repeats, I use the offset filter in Photoshop. This lets you move the seam in the texture from being at the top and bottom, or left and right for that matter, to somewhere else on the image. That way, the edges of the seam are next to each other rather than on opposite ends, and can be blended much more easily. Photoshop's AI tools are super helpful for this, since you can just rectangle select an area and generative fill it without a prompt, and it'll make things look about how they should. But I can't just go using dangerous and immoral AI tools all willy-nilly, because first of all, it's probably going to steal from hundreds of artists. Or at least the one artist who made this leaf texture, since that's all it needs to sample from and generate more leaves. But I'm sure I've only got a few more generative fills left before our society collapses. Luckily for me, however, I don't have to worry about that, since I can just use the eraser tool and kinda erase stuff. There we go, no more seam. But these leaves don't make sense anymore without trees here, so I used Alt-D to duplicate trees around, but also still have them linked, so that way I can change them all at once if I need to. But of course, now that I'm actually using this precaution, I won't be able to find any issues. But with the trees in place and everything, this looks nice. After this, I closed things off by setting up more balconies and adding a few more little details to some places. Some benches here, some flower boxes there, and you know, I think they really help. Well, it looks like that's all for this week in Delfino Square. Let me know what you think about the shortcut. Well, I hope you enjoyed. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.